بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وقدوة الأتقياء سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we have, by the grace and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reached the section on Babu Idrak al-Farida ma al-Imami wa ghayrihi. Right? The chapter on catching the obligatory prayer with the Imam and other issues. Wa ghayrihi ay min al-masail, right? And other issues. So this is a chapter on assorted issues, beginning with catching the fard with the Imam, right? And the foundational issue is that the Jama'ah, for men, the Jama'ah is the asl, right? Number one, right? That is the ada'ul kamil. That's the complete performance, the complete current performance for men is praying in congregation. That's one consideration. Second consideration is that the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ, once the prayer begins, فَلَا صَلَاةَ إِلَّا الْمَكْتُوبَةِ, there's no prayer except the obligatory prayer. We also see different hadiths and athar from the Sahaba as well of breaking, if one started one's own, breaking the prayer and joining the Imam. Right? That's consideration number 3. Consideration number 4 is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us in the Quran, in Surah Muhammad, verse 33 or 32, 33, that لا تبطلوا أعمالكم, do not render your efforts vain. Right? لا تبطلوا أعمالكم. If you begin something, from that, if you begin something, there's a shuru'u mulzim. Completing is an action that you begun is required. So in a simple way, if you've started the prayer, given this package of considerations, the asl of the prayer is praying with the Imam. That once the prayer begins, right? When إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ أي إِذَا شَرَعَ الْإِمَامُ فِي الصَّلَاةِ, right? The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ أي إِذَا شرع الإمام في الصلاة بالتكبير, i.e. that once the Imam has begun the prayer, فلا صلاة, then there is no prayer إلا المكتوبة, except for the obligatory prayer. Now, فلا صلاة, there is no prayer that you can initiate except the obligatory prayer with the Imam. So there's a consideration of catching the Imam. There's of course the consideration of reward. But then there's the athar that you can break the prayer and join the Imam. But then there's a challenge, which is at the same time we have been prohibited from breaking something that you begin. Correct? لا تبطلوا أعمالكم, right, from Surah Muhammad, from which the fuqaha establish the principle that الشروع mulzim, that beginning makes it incumbent to complete. Another way it's expressed, الشروع يوجب الإتمام, beginning makes completing wajib. So these are the considerations. You can number them as 5 or 6. Now from that, if you look at a continuum, if you've started the fard If you started the fard and the imam on your own and the imam starts, then basically if you're at a very simple conceptual level, if you're at the beginning of the prayer, then catching the imam is given precedence. The only question then is how, right? If you're right in the beginning of the prayer, if you've done one rak'ah, let's say it's a 4 rak'ah prayer, if you're right in the beginning or if you've just done 1 rak'ah, catching the imam is given precedence. Do you just end the prayer if you're right at the beginning, or do you complete it as 2 rak'ahs, right, of nafil? However, what if you have prayed most of the prayer? Then which consideration predominates? The consideration catching the imam or the consideration of completing what you start? If you've done most of the prayer, and we look at the fiqh of what's most of the prayer, then the consideration of itmam is given precedence, because there's a whole range of considerations weighing in on this chapter in a very simplified way. There's other principles, etc., that enter, but this is a very simplified way. What's given precedence? Now, what you begin with could be a nafil, like a non-fard, or you could have begun a fard. So when you map out the chapter, that's another thing to keep in mind. What if you started in your sunnah and the imam is praying? What if you started in a fard and the imam is praying? Because there are some nuances between the two. Okay. Then there are some exceptions to the chapter, right? Which are, what if, can you initiate a sunnah? Because it's not conceivable that you could initiate the fard if the imam is praying the fard, correct? But what if the imam has begun or is about to begin? Can you initiate a sunnah? If the imam has begun, that's where the consideration إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ فَلَا صَلَاةَ إِلَّا الْمَكْتُوبَةِ applies. You enter, you haven't done the sunnah of dhuhr, you join the congregation, wa sallallahu wa barak. That's obvious. More subtle is, right? That's the general consideration, right? There's one exception to that, which is the sunnah of fajr. You enter, you haven't done the sunnah of fajr. Where does that fall under the continuum? Because there are general principles, but with the sunnah of fajr, there are 2 considerations. And the Shafi'is criticize us for this, but because Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ فَلَا صَلَاةَ إِلَّا الْمَكْتُوبَةِ. If the prayer has commenced, right? And iqamatu salah can refer to 2 things: that the iqama is given, or that the imam has begun, right? And it's used in both ways in different hadiths, right? Similarly, إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ فَامْشُوا إِلَيْهَا بِالسَّكِينَةِ وَالْوَقَارِ, etc. You can see, right? But a good thing, and there's so many hadiths mentioned إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ, etc. You have to be clear, is it referring to iqama or the beginning of prayer? Simple thing is keep checking what the ulama say, particularly the ulama of our madhab. And so there's some ikhtilaf that arises. Anyways, with the sunnah of fajr, what is the consideration that enters upon it? Under the general principles, it would fall under إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ فَلَا صَلَاةَ إِلَّا الْمَكْتُوبَةِ. So with the general principles, that what we call the qiyas in the issue, the qiyas with sunnat al-fajr would be, what would the qiyas in sunnat al-fajr be? You haven't prayed the sunnah of fajr, and the imam has begun the fard of fajr, what do? What would the qiyas be?
Not to pray it.
Not to pray it, right? Now, and that's the position taken in some of the other madhabs, because they give precedence to the ahadith al-qawliya of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But we have a whole body of texts from the Sahaba, Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, of the fuqaha of the Sahaba, who did this and taught this. That is, the Imam begins, that if the Imam has begun the Fard of Fajr and you haven't prayed the Sunnah, it's related from them that they would pray in a corner and join. So it's from their own fi'l and their repeated fi'l, and from their teaching as well. And these are fuqaha of the Sahaba. Now, from usul al-fiqh, what do we see? That the Sunnah of the Sahaba, especially the fuqaha of the Sahaba, is given legal consideration. We touched upon this briefly in Mukhtasar al-Manar, just briefly, when we come to Samtul Wusul of al-Aqhasari, we'll see a little more about it. And if you're curious, you can read a little more about it there. Right? And the Hanafis consider a distinction between the learned Sahaba and Umumus Sahaba, especially in establishing the Sunnah. Now, when we look at the fi'l of those Sahaba, it is strengthened by the high degree of prophetic emphasis with respect to the Sunnah of Fajr. Right? That perform it, وَلَوْ طَرَدَتْكُمُ الْخَيْلِ. In other words, that's mubalagha, that perform it even if the enemy horses are trampling you. And that's, of course, the mafhum minhu is mubalagha. It's for emphasis. Literally, if the enemy horses are trampling you, you can skip the fard, right? As we know from the prophetic example, right? So these are this sort of a framework for the issues of this chapter. Okay. So, قال الإمام الشرنبلالي رحمة الله تعالى عليه ونفعنا به وبكم: إذا شرع المصلي في أداء الفرض أو قضائه منفردا أو في نفل وحضرت جنازة يخشى فواتها أو منذور وأقيمت الجماعة في محل أدائه لا في غيره بأن أحرم الإمام، لأن حقيقة إقامة الشيء فعله لا مجرد الشروع في الإقامة. So he says, right? Sometimes in a commentary, if you just read the commentary on its own, you get lost in all the nuances. So you read the matan first. إذا شرع في فرض منفردا فأقيمت الجماعة قطع. If one starts in the fard alone and the congregation is established, one cuts the prayer. إن لم يسجد لها, if one hasn't prostrated for it. لما شرع فيه, if one hasn't prostrated for one began. That's the idea of the continuum. If you're right in the beginning of the prayer, joining the imam is given precedence over the side of completing the prayer. Right? أو سجد في غير رباعية, or one prostrated in other than a 4 rak'ah prayer. Because in a 2 rak'ah prayer, if one has done 1 rak'ah, then now, in a 2 rak'ah prayer, if one has done 1 rak'ah, one's now done most of the prayer. Right? By completing 1 rak'ah, standing up from the prostrations from it. So one would complete it. Right? وإن سجد في رباعية ضم ركعة ثانية. If one prostrated, I did 1 rak'ah of a 4 rak'ah prayer, one adds an extra rak'ah and it counts as a nafil. وسلم. Right? So let's take that. But then he adds loads of nuances. When diagramming things like this, even if you studied the matan before, a good discipline is diagram the matan on its own first, then that gives you the skeletal framework, then add all the details of the commentary. My mother is an artist. How does she draw a tree? You don't draw a tree by drawing all the leaves, right? First you draw the trunk, then the branch, then the main branches, then the secondary branches. Once you've drawn that, then you put in the leaves, right? So he says, إذا شرع المصلي, if the one praying begins in doing a current performance of the fard or in making it up, right? Right? On their own, or if they begin a nafl, right? Right? Or if they begin a nafl, right? And a janazah comes that one fears missing, and that's the asl, right? Janazah is a fard kifaya, right? So you just began a nafl and there's a janazah, you can cut the prayer, right? If you fear missing it, which would be the default, right? Because the janazah is very brief. And also because the nafl, you can make it up. There's no qada of janazah. Aw manzoor, or a vowed prayer, right? And the vowed prayer is a little problematic, right? And the congregation begins, right? فَأُقِيمَتِ الْجَمَاعَةِ, then the congregation begins in the place where one is praying, right? In the place where one is praying, right? If you're at home, then can you catch the congregation to begin with, right? That'll be a separate issue. Like where we lived in Damascus, like from the kitchen, there's a little window. If you stuck your hand, if you open the grill as well, you stuck your hand, you could like literally just take your hand out and you could touch the corner of the masjid, because the masjid in our building weren't built perpendicular to each other. They're at different angles. Brilliant engineering. In the same place, right? Because if you're somewhere else, then you also have to consider, could you catch the congregation if you broke your prayer? Okay. لا في غيره, right? Not elsewhere. But the consideration is that if you, like, so if you started praying the fard at home, like you woke up, you thought you'd miss the congregation of dhuhr, and you started praying dhuhr, and they start in the masjid, then if you can break your prayer and go to the masjid and you're reasonably sure you can catch it, then you'd also cut. But this is, but if you're somewhere else, i.e. بحيث لا يصل إلى الجماعة لا في غيره إن لم يصل إلى الجماعة, if one would not reach the congregation, right? Because if you're praying next to the masjid, then okay. بأن أحرم الإمام, right? Such that the imam began. أحرم الإمام أي أدى التحريم. And so what's meant by أقيمت, إقامة here is شروع الإمام في الصلاة, right? It's that the imam began the prayer. And he gives an explanation. This is how we understand the hadith. إذا أقيمت الصلاة. لأن حقيقة إقامة الشيء, because the reality of establishing something is doing it. لا مجرد الشروع في الإقامة, not merely beginning the إقامة. That's why, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, when the mu'adhin or the muqim, the one who gives the إقامة, says قد قامت الصلاة, the prayer has commenced, the Imam says Allahu Akbar, because the حقيقة الإقامة is not أداء الإقامة but الشروع, right? إقامة الشيء الإتيان به, right? أقيموا الصلاة, right? In the Quran, يقيمون الصلاة. It's not they give the إقامة for the prayer, meaning that they perform the prayer, is the actual فعل, right? Right? Or فعله على الوجه المطلوب, right? Because إقامة also has the sense of doing it, but also أقام الشيء أتاه على وجه الكمال. لا مجرد الشروع, not simply starting it, right? So if they give a slow إقامة, you could just finish your nafil, right? Even if you just began. فإذا لم يقيد بسجدة, if you haven't even performed one sajda, right? قطع بتسليمة قائمة, one cuts the prayer. And what's the proper way of cutting the prayer? By giving a salam standing, right? 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 Now you could break it in other ways too, right? But the optimal is to give the salam standing or to give the salam wherever you are in the prayer. But the situation would be, if you're in ruku', for example, you would say, Sami Allahu liman hamida, get out of ruku' and then give the salam. That would be superior, right? But if you just walked away, that would also be valid, right? Right? Okay. And that's how you break other prayers too, right? So for example, if you're praying and someone is drowning, you're praying by the river and someone's drowning, the optimal is say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and then you go save them. But if you fear that they'll drown, you could just run and catch them, right? Okay. وَبَعْدَهُ, right? And after, بعد القطع اقتدى على الصحيح. And after breaking the prayer, one follows, according to sound opinion. وقيل لا يقطع حتى يتم ركعتين. And the other opinion is that one doesn't break the prayer until one has done 2 rak'ahs. من رباعية كالمتنفل الذي لا يخشى فوت جنازة. Right? The other opinion is no. That if you've just begun, fulfill it as 2 rak'ahs. Right? Even if you haven't done 1 rak'ah, you just began your 4 rak'ah prayer. Complete it as 2, whether fard or nafil, and then join. Right? كالذي لا يخشى فوت الجنازة. And the same ruling is for the one who doesn't fear missing the janazah. Right? How would you not fear missing the janazah? You know the imam. The imam's a really pious old man, and you know he always makes long du'as for the deceased. Okay, so you say, I'll finish my nafil and catch him. Right? I have a Shafi'i friend. When I used to be hardcore Hanafi, we were on the way to Zarqa. We got stuck in a traffic jam between Amman and Zarqa. So we stopped at a masjid. And I didn't pray behind him, right? Because we missed the main congregation. So he started leading Maghrib. And I prayed on my own. Sheikh Amjad Rashid was with us. He didn't have wudu. Adab would have been to wait 2 more minutes, let Sheikh Amjad finish his wudu and let him lead, because he's the most learned of us. But the brother wanted to start, so everyone said, okay, you lead then. I didn't want to pray behind him anyways, but I used to be Hanafi, I didn't used to do second jama'ah at all. So I was praying on the side. No exaggeration. The brother finished the Fatiha, and the first rak'ah, hadn't fully finished the first rak'ah, like the first ruku'. I'd done 3 rak'ahs completely, because of how slowly he recited the Fatiha. So every person knows themselves, right? Okay. So this is the relied upon position, what's mentioned in the Matan. He says, قُلْنَا الْقَطْعُ لِلْإِكْمَالِ الْقَطْعُ لِلْإِكْمَالِ إِكْمَالٌ. This is a principle, that breaking the prayer in order to do things more completely is the more complete way of doing things, right? Why? Because he said, if you could do 2 things, you could finish your nafil and join, that would be better than making qata'. He said, no, but this qata' is not bringing a deficiency, but you're breaking this prayer to do things more completely, right? And what is more completely? That there's this whole range of considerations that we highlighted in the beginning. Okay. وَهُوَ بِمَحَلِّ الرَّفْض. What is huwa? أي ما دون ركعة في محل الرفض. وهو أي ما دون ركعة في محل الرفض. As Tahtawi mentions here. Alhamdulillah. Right? That's why it's good to take notes, folks. Right? وهو أي ما دون ركعة في محل الرفض. Right? Right? What is less than 1 rak'ah does not have the ruling of a complete cycle of prayer yet. Right? So that is easier to leave. And it has many examples of that elsewhere, like if someone got up for an extra rak'ah, etc. وَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ حَلَفَ لَا يُصَلِّي لَا يَحْنَثْ بِمَا دُونَ الرَّكْعَةِ. And that's why if someone swore an oath that they will not pray, meaning someone swore an oath that, even in general, I will not pray nafil, and they started the nafil, do they break their vow? No, unless they had performed a whole rak'ah. بِمَا دُونَ الرَّكْعَةِ. وَالْجَنَازَةِ لَا خَلَفَ لَهَا. And the janazah has no substitute. If missed, there's no. وَبِالْقَضَاءِ يَجْمَعُ بَيْنَ الْمَصْلَحَتَيْنِ. And if you make up what you began of the nafil, for example, one joins between the two maslahas. The maslaha of catching the prayer that has begun and doing the prayer that you had individually begun. Okay. So this paragraph, Imam al-Shurmu'i has brought loads of things. You need to break it down into notes. How? Write out the matan, diagram it, then fill, and keep that diagram on its own. Make a second diagram, put the matan, and then add these details from the commentary, and then you can see the issue. We can only unpack it for you. You need to digest it yourself, right? مَا لَمْ يَسْجُدْ لِمَا شَرَعَ فِيهِ. As this is, you break the prayer as long as you've not done sajda for the prayer that you started on your own. وَلَوْ غَيْرَ رُبَاعِيَّةٍ. Even if it's not a 4 rak'ah prayer. Right? Right? أو سجد للركعة الأولى. Or if one prostrated for the first rak'ah في غير الرباعية, in other than a 4 rak'ah prayer, بأن كان في الفجر أو المغرب فيقطع بعد السجود بتسليمة. So then, right, if, for example, if you're in Fajr or Maghrib, then you would break the prayer after the sujood with 1 salam. لأنه لو أضاف في الثانية ركعة أخرى تم الفرض. Because if one added, if لو أضاف في الثنائية ركعة أخرى تم الفرض. Because if you've prostrated for other than a 4 rak'ah prayer, like meaning a 2 rak'ah prayer like Fajr, or a 3 rak'ah prayer like Maghrib, right? If you did another sajda and you completed 2 rak'ahs, what would happen? In the Fajr, you would have completed the prayer, so then you can't join the Imam. And in Maghrib, by prostrating for the 2nd rak'ah, you would have prayed most of Maghrib, so then the side of completing the prayer would preponderate over the side of joining the Imam. Right? لأنه لو أضاف في الثنائية أي الفجر, because if in a 2 rak'ah prayers one added another rak'ah, تم الفرض, the fard would be over, because the fard of Fajr is 2 rak'ahs. وتفوته الجماعة في الفجر, and then you would have missed the congregation in Fajr. ولا يتنفل بعدها أي بعد الفجر مطلقا, and there is no nafil after Fajr, absolutely. And الإعادة, right, ينوى فيها الفرض وتقع نفلا, and the repeated prayer you intend the fard, but it counts as a nafil. Right? وفي المغرب للأكثر حكم الكل. So if you've prostrated for Maghrib, then you would still you've done 1 rak'ah of Maghrib, right? What would happen? You wouldn't complete it as 2 rak'ahs, because if you prostrate for the 2nd rak'ah, then you've prayed most of the prayer, and the side of completing the prayer preponderates now over the side of joining the Imam. Then what do you do there? You just make the intention that had I been able to, I would have prayed in congregation, and you have the thawab of your intention, if sincere. Right? وفي المغرب للأكثر حكم الكل. Right? And in Maghrib, if you added a 2nd rak'ah, the most of the prayer, which would be 2 rak'ahs of the 3, and it becomes the second rak'ah. If you've prostrated for the second rak'ah, takes the ruling of the most, so you would, even if you stood up for the second rak'ah of Maghrib, you'd break the prayer and join the Maghrib. فَتَفُوتُهُ الْجَمَاعَةِ, so you'd miss the congregation. وَلَا يُتَنَفَّلُ مَعَ الْإِمَامِ فِيهَا, and you cannot make nafil behind the imam with it. Right? So you can't pray Maghrib on your own and then join the imam in the Maghrib. Why? لِمَنْعِ التَّنَفُّلِ بِالْبُتَيْرَةِ, because of the prohibition of making nafil with an odd number of rak'ahs. And again, if you pray a prayer and then you pray it behind the imam, the second prayer counts as the i'adah. You intend the fard. Right? So for example, if I prayed dhuhr on my own, and then Sidi Bilal comes and he hasn't prayed, I can pray behind him and intend i'adah, to repeat my dhuhr. The fard would be the first. I can intend dhuhr with the second, but it counts as a nafil and I get the reward of the congregation. But you can do that for all prayers, the fuqaha say. Right? تصح الإعادة في الصلوات كلها. Repeating the prayer to get the reward is permitted in all the prayers, theoretically. إلا الفجر والعصر والمغرب. Except for Fajr and Asr and Maghrib. Fajr, no nafil permitted after it. Asr, no nafil permitted after it. Maghrib, because you can't make nafil with an odd number. That's the tanafful bil-butayra. وَمُخَالَفَةُ الْإِمَامِ بِإِضَافَةِ رَابِعَةٍ. Right? And if you try to pray, repeat your Maghrib and add a rak'ah, then your intention and the intention of the Imam differ, and you can't do that. Okay. وإن سجد وهو في رباعية كالظهر ضم ركعة ثانية صيانة للمؤدى عن البطلان. If you've prostrated, i.e. performed one rak'ah of a 4 rak'ah prayer, such as dhuhr, you add a rak'ah, a second rak'ah to it, making it 2 rak'ahs, and in order to protect what you have performed from invalidation, right? You can even map out the scale that we gave. The scale catching the congregation versus not invalidating your action. What happens at the beginning of the prayer at 1 rak'ah, and if you've done more than that, right? You can do a lot of doodling with this to understand it. وَتَشَهَّدَ وَسَلَّمَ لِتَصِيرَ الرَّكْعَتَانِ لَهُ نَافِلَةً. And in this case, you would make tashahhud and give salams in order for the 2 rak'ahs to be a nafil for one. Right? Right? And here, of course, Imam al-Tahtawi goes into a lot of details. My advice is don't look at Tahtawi until you've diagrammed what's in the Matan, then the Maraqi, right? Unless you just want to clarify a word or an expression, because sometimes Imam Tahtawi is having a broader conversation on things, like he goes into here, what is mentioned in the Asl of Muhammad al-Hasan, etc. And frankly, until you've understood the issues themselves, don't worry about these extra details. Right? And then once you've got the matan and the sharh down pat, then you look at Tahtawi and you'll understand. Right? It's like if you cook a meal, right? You put the ingredients in a tartib. Right? You're trying to make a pizza, you don't throw the flour and the water and the ingredients and the cheese all together and start baking. Right? There's a tartib in how you put together, otherwise it won't be pizza, it'll be mushy wheat stew. And that's how a lot of people's legal mind is. It's mushy, legal stew. It's not edible. Allah. Right? So if we do this, ثم اقتدى مفترضا, then one follows the Imam praying the fard. لإحراز فضل الجماعة, to catch the virtue of the jama'ah, right? Which is the governing consideration. This applies a fortiori to men, right? But women can do this too if they wish. But the fuqaha say for women, if they're praying, like for example, they're praying dhuhr on their own at the masjid, and the congregation begins, do they have to break the prayer? Right? Women have the complete reward of their salah, even in the masjid, if they pray on their own. But if they want to do muwafaqat al-jama'ah, same principles apply. Right? Which would sometimes be wiser, especially when there's a lot of people around and you don't want to confuse people while you doing your own thing. Right? وَإِن صَلَّ ثَلَاثًا مِنْ رُبَاعِيَّةٍ فَأُقِيمَتْ أَتَمَّهَا. But if one has prayed 3 rak'ahs and one has prayed 3 rak'ahs, when is one considered to pray 3?
After one has prostrated for the third?
Yeah. بِالسُّجُودِ لِلثَّالِثَةِ, by having prostrated for the 3rd rak'ah. فَأُقِيمَتْ, and the prayer begins, meaning the imam has begun in the way described. أَتَمَّهَا, then one completes the 4 rak'ah prayer. أَرْبَعًا مُنْفَرِدًا حُكْمًا لِلْأَكْثَرِ, then one completes it as 4 rak'ahs, right? Because لِلْأَكْثَرِ حُكْمُ الْكُلِّ, and يعني ويغلب, right, اعتبار الإكمال, right? And here the consideration of completing the prayer is preferred, right? And that's why that continuum that we've mentioned is good to keep in mind. Okay. Now, do you miss out? لا, ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى, right? In that kind of situation, like for example, like you were praying Asr on your own in the masjid because you looked at the schedule and they said that the adhan is given at 6 p.m. They pray at 6:15. You got there at 6:30. There's nobody around. So you started praying. You're in the 3rd rak'ah. Now you finished the 3rd rak'ah. You're prostrating the 3rd rak'ah. Of course, this is where knowing your fiqh can help you. When is the sajda completed? By placing your head on the ground or by raising your head on the ground? Right? Anybody know that? I don't want guesses. Anybody know the answer? You know it.
Yes.
Okay. Is there khilaf on it?
Yes.
Okay, so what's the answer?
Imam Abu Yusuf said it's the placing of the face on the floor, and Imam Muhammad said it's when you lift your face.
And what's the relied upon position? Okay, you got most of it. Where do you get all that from?
Maraqi.
Good. Somebody refuse. Okay. So in al-hasanat yudhibna sayyat, Sidi. So this compensates for a really well asked question. So it's good. But it's hard to satisfy me. You should know what's the relied upon position. What's the assumption? What will be the relied upon position?
Imam Abu Yusuf.
The assumption will be Abu Yusuf, right? Right? But there's ikhtilaf in tasheeh. So Hanafi faqih could intend that, okay, my head is still in prostration, I'll take the opinion of cutting the prayer while still in prostration, and then you could still catch the prayer. But don't do that. But if you want to want to do all, you can't tell the common person this. So what does one do? In that situation, just complete your prayer, and إِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى. You did not miss the congregation out of slacking, out of laxity, out of shortcoming. You didn't catch it, you have the intention of catching it, and you have the full reward. Right? Okay. Bismillah. وعن محمد يتمها جالسا لينقلب نفلا. And there's a narration from Imam Muhammad that one completes it sitting down. Right? So one breaks it by sitting down. Because can you sit down, sit in the final rak'ah? when you can pray standing? Can you? So what's the situation? In Asr, you don't get up, but you just finish the prayer standing, it necessarily turns into a nafil. But this is not, so you don't do qiyam in the fourth rak'ah. This is not relied upon. So no. Right? And Imam Shurun Bulali here, since he's taken you through a long journey, right? You see him increasing the complexity of his text's expression, right? Have you noticed last couple of chapters he's bringing in usuli principles and other? Here he's introducing you to another thing, that when we say an, this is a riwayah. It's to say an Abi Hanifa, an Abi Yusuf, an Muhammad, this is a narration. When you say inda, this is their madhab, this is their formal established position. So anhu, this is related from him. But هذا, this is not the relied upon position. فيجمع بين ثواب النفل والفرض بالجماعة. Right? 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 Rather, you get that reward in these situations by the intention. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Kareem. Right? That if you had in your heart that even the ulama say the sense of regret at missing the jama'ah is niyat idrak al-jama'ah. Right? Right? Because the niyyah is dafi'ul qalb, nahwa al-fi'l. Right? It's the heart's urge towards the action. So you had that urge. But it is best to make a formal intention. It's best to make a formal intention. That's why they mention when the adhan, when the time comes in, right? One, right? Intends to fulfill the, to perform the prayer على أكمل وجه ممكن. To perform the prayer in the most complete way that I can. And then sometimes life sends you all kinds of curveballs, so you navigate the best you can. But if you made the formal intention, then Allah is Kareem, right? But it's best to do وظائف العبودية. So if the time comes in, same thing. You make the formal intention, then you die. You intended to do that prayer. It's not just relying on mere divine largesse, but also on divine largesse itself, but also you've taken the sabab. So you've done idhar al-ubudiyya. So it's a safe thing. Time comes in, you intend, so Isha time is in, I intend to pray Isha in the most complete way possible, and that is the best thing. ثم اقتدى متنفلا. Right? ثم بعد الإتمام اقتدى متنفلا. Then after completing the 4 rak'ah prayer, one follows, then one prays behind the imam doing a nafil. Right? In sha'a. Right? If one wishes. وهو الأفضل لعدم الكراهة. And that is superior because there's no dislike. إلا في العصر, except in Asr. That's in the matan. But again, he had to tweak the matan. والفجر, and likewise Fajr. Of course, what have we already taken? We've already dealt with Fajr, right? Sorry, we have already dealt with Maghrib, right? Right? But he reiterates it for emphasis. إلا في العصر والفجر للنهي عن التنفل بعدهما. So you can do this in all prayers except Asr and Fajr, because in these two, there's a prohibition of performing nafil after them. وفي المغرب للمخالفة. And in Maghrib, you can't pray behind the Imam due to mukhalafah. So practically, you can follow behind the Imam after completing the same fard on your own in Dhuhr and Isha. لأنه عليه الصلاة والسلام قال إذا صليت في أهلك ثم أدركت الصلاة فصلها إلا في الفجر والمغرب. Because of the hadith that has come, that if you pray with your family, then you catch the prayer, then pray it. Meaning, if you caught the prayer, meaning the congregational prayer, the al is referential, it's للعهد الذهني, or the al is للمطلق ينصرف إلى الكامل. Then pray it except in Fajr and Maghrib. وقوله فصلها, and he's saying then pray it يعني نفلا, meaning نفلا. لأنه أمر به نصا لرجلين لم يصليا معه الظهر. And because the Prophet ﷺ commanded this to two people that did not pray behind him at dhuhr, وأخبرا بصلاتهما في رحالهما, and who informed the Prophet ﷺ that they prayed at home. فقال صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا صليتما في رحالكما ثم أتيتما صلاة قوم فصليا معهم. Because the Prophet ﷺ told them that if, the hadith is in Abu Dawud and elsewhere, if you pray at home and then you come to a people's prayer, then pray with them. Right? وَجْعَلَا صَلَاتَكُمَا مَعَهُمْ سُبْحَةً أي نافلة كما في النهاية. And then, and make your prayer with them a subha. A subha is a nafila, as explained in the nihaya. You have to be careful about the nihaya, because the nihaya can refer to either as-Sighnaqi's magisterial sharh on the hidayah, which is the earliest of the major shuruh, at least, of the hidayah, possibly the earliest complete sharh on the hidayah of Imam al-Sighnaqi. But frequently when explaining rare words, it's referring to a-Nihaya of Ibn al-Athir, which is in Gharib al-Hadith, in explaining rare expressions of hadith. وإن قام لثالثة رباعية منفردا فأقيمت الجماعة قبل سجوده للثالثة قطع قائما. And if one stood up for the third rak'ah of a fourth rak'ah on one's own, and the congregational prayer begins before one has prostrated in the third rak'ah, one breaks one's prayer standing, and that's the optimal. لأن القعود للتحلل وهذا قطع, because the qu'ud is to end the prayer, and this is a breaking of the prayer بتسليمة, with one salam, أو عاد إلى القعود, or one sits back down في الأصح, according to the more correct opinion. وقال شمس الأئمة السرخسي, and Imam al-Sarakhsi said إن لم يعد للقعود فسدت صلاته. Imam al-Sarakhsi said if one does not go back to the sujood, the prayer is broken, meaning that nafil of 2 rak'ahs is broken. لأنه لا بد من القعود ولأن المؤدى لم تقع فرضا. Right? And this is his opinion, but that's not the relied upon opinion. Right? That, so if the nafil, you got up for it, got up from it, then it would not be valid. وقال فخر الإسلام لا صح أنه يكبر قائما. So if you stood for the third, فخر الإسلام, who is فخر الإسلام? Yeah, al-Bazdawi said al-Asah, the more correct opinion is that one gives أنه يكبر قائما, that if you already stood up, one gives a takbir أي للقطع, standing, ينوي الشروع في صلاة الإمام, intends, يعني, so he says يكبر قائما يكبر للقطع. Right? Right? So one gives takbir. He's already told us the takbir, you do this to break the prayer. So you give the takbir to end that prayer. And the intention is, I'm not just breaking the prayer like that, but you have the intention that in order to catch the imam. And that's given. if someone asks you, why are you ending a 4 rak'ah prayer here? It says to catch the imam. So the intention is there. فَيَحْصُلُ الْخَتْمِ فِي ضِمْنِ شُرُوعِهِ فِي صَلَاةِ الْإِمَامِ. So that way you ended the prayer within catching the imam. When شاء رفع يديه, and if one wishes, one raises one's hands. So so Fakhr al-Islam, what does he say? That you can just give one takbir to make qata' and to join the imam, if you're standing in the rows, for example. But it's probably it's superior to give 2 takbirs. One for pure qata'. So here, sometimes they put wows at the end, right? And this, these are other opinions. But in itself, what's superior? What's mentioned earlier. You give 1 takbir for qata', and then you join the imam as you normally would. That is superior, right? Imam al-Sarakhsi's opinion is for caution, that it's best to do what? To go back, sit down, and end the 2 rak'ahs as you should have. It's not required. Imam Fakhr al-Islam al-Bazdawi is saying that when you cut the prayer, you could combine 2 intentions in 1 takbir. It is that you're breaking this prayer and entering into the next prayer. Also because the tahrima is a shart, it's not a rukn. Right? But it's better to just end 1 prayer and then start the other prayer. That's better and safer. Okay? And in that it says, وَإِنْ شَاءَ رَفَعَ يَدَيْهِ. In this you could raise your hands, but it's a sunnah, and you maybe might not do it just because you don't want to confuse other people, etc. Right? And so, for example, one day, I delayed joining the prayer for example, in Amman, because this guy, he had major waswasa. He came and stood next to me. I was about to start the prayer, and he repeated the takbir multiple times because he was studying Shafi'i fiqh, but he kept getting confused. Allah. I was like, oh my God. I actually wanted to step away and go pray somewhere else. I said, so I just waited for him to finish giving his takbirs before I started. But the guy was a righteous man. So by the time he was done, he gave, I think, at least 10 takbirs. I said Allahu Akbar, I intended the wrong prayer. I forget which one it was. Like it was Dhuhr, I intended Asr. Right? So now we're halfway into the first rak'ah. So I started the wrong prayer. Deliberately, I thought it was Asr. Right? So what do? In that kind of situation, if I say Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and I say takbir again, I'm making tashwish on other people. And it's also a person, al-mar'u la yafdah nafsahu. One doesn't cast shame on oneself. So what does one do? The salam, you say quietly to oneself, you don't turn your head. And then if you make the takbir to enter the prayer, you enter it without other other matters, right? Okay. So those are the first issues. Then we see, what if one is doing the sunnah? So this is if one began the fard, right? Okay. Now what if one is doing the sunnah of Jum'ah, or one is doing other sunnah prayers? We'll see what one does. So we will continue from here. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب